Couple of seconds of logistics. I'll mute just so we have. I think most of you have muted already, which is great. Thanks and welcome today to our session on negotiations and conflict resolution. I'm going to probably focus more on negotiations because many of the same skills are involved in conflict resolution, but I'll just talk briefly about that at the end because I've got a lot of stuff to share with you, interesting stuff. But let's get started. So if anybody's new, let's just go over how you use the chat box. I think most of you figured it out already. What you're going to see on your screen are these icons. You want to depress the one that looks like a cartoon bubble. By the way, what I'm showing you here is a picture. So you actually have to hit the one that's on your screen that I can't see. And you're going to get a box that looks like this. Depending on your browser, it might look slightly different. And you want to type in the area here. So if you can do me a favor right now, can you put your name and your district? Or if you're from the University of Southern Mississippi, USM is fine. And also if you're from a team. You know, if you're coming as a group, it'd be great. So I know HenHUD's a group, okay? Okay, sounds good. So it's been our custom whenever we do these sessions to always have a little quiz question. I know a number of you last week, the weeks seem to fade into each other. Last week, I was doing an on-site program at BOCES, and a few people participated. We did a versions of so you want to be an educational office professional, kind of like you want to be a millionaire. So I kind of have a question of the session today. And we'll see how this goes. Okay, so rather than do those questions, because some of you may have known them already, here's your question for today. And this has to do with office staff in popular culture. So what TV show is this secretary? Okay, we got one The Office and one Mad Men. Anybody else want to take a guess? I guess we don't have big TV watchers here. Okay, there we go. I have to admit, this is one of the harder questions. Because it's certainly not, as a common one as some of the other ones we've seen. But actually, it's from Mad Men. And she's actually one of these people. She starts out as an office staff member and actually eventually gets promoted to an account executive, which for the time period was rather unusual for a woman to be in that role. So yes, those of you who got Mad Men, you got the answer right. So I'm just shutting this down so I can pull up the presentation on negotiations. Okay, so I have a lot of stuff to share with you about negotiations. So let's first of all just begin by talking about what a negotiation is. You know, when people think of negotiations, they tend to think of it as kind of the formal process of something like contract negotiations, and that certainly is a form of negotiation, but I would argue that all human beings have to negotiate. In fact, it's something we learn about very early in our life. So, for example, do you remember when you were in a toy store as a little girl, since most of you are women, all of you are women, okay, and you wanted a toy and your mom said no. So what did you do? You negotiated. and, and sometimes it was effective. So negotiation is really something that anybody who's involved in an active life is going to have to do. So we have to negotiate with our customers, sometimes with employers, with neighbors if we have a dispute over something, certainly with our spouses over like where you're going to go to vacation or what movie you're going to watch or where we're going to go out. So anytime, it's just a good idea to have a kind of a broad definition of what negotiations is. So I would suggest in the broadest sense, negotiations is anytime you have a situation involving two or more people who have a different preference. So even as something as simple as I'd like to go for Italian food, you would prefer Chinese food, and we have to, unless we want to eat separately, we're going to have to come up with some sort of a negotiation about which choice we make. So we're always involved in negotiations. Obviously, some negotiations are bigger than others, but that's kind of at the core what a negotiation is. And I think it's the fact that there's some difference, it's a conversation about how to reach some sort of a beneficial conclusion on at least one of these issues. And a beneficial conclusion would simply be some sort of a resolution in which both of the parties can come to an agreement, which isn't always the case. We're not always able to even reach an agreement, but that's kind of the objective of a negotiation. It's to reach an agreement of some kind. So there are this is a very dynamic activity, and that's why no matter how much time I spent on this, clearly I have an hour today, you could probably spend hours, weeks, maybe a lifetime learning about all of the different subtle details involved in negotiations. And I've had the benefit of being both a presenter and attending sessions at a group called the National Association of they're actually of Education Negotiators. And that organization actually consists of mostly attorneys or labor relations specialists who work for school districts and are involved in representing the school district in contract negotiations. Now, the last time I was there, they actually had some folks who are also representing labor unions as well. But we attend, so it's an ongoing process to learn about how to be more effective at negotiating because there are so many moving parts. But I would like to suggest that if we think about the attributes of negotiations, and again, all the pieces that fit in place, it involves things like communicating, obviously, marketing in the sense that you're promoting your ideas, assertiveness, conflict resolution, persuasion, threats, listening, and when it's done well, problem solving. So it is very dynamic. So I'm just going to try to share just some of the foundational concepts and ideas and takeaways that I think can be helpful for you, whether you're negotiating a union contract or you're simply negotiating a salary increase, or you're negotiating the solution to a problem when you're serving on a committee where people might have a different agreement, a different opinion about how we should accomplish an objective. So all of these kinds of skills come into place. So we have to think about what the finished products are of a negotiation, and those finished products are things like an agreement, a sale. So, for example, if you are going to, not so much in retail sales, but, for example, if you're going to a garage sale and you're haggling with the seller on the price, or even you're haggling with a car salesman about the price of what to pay for a car, all of those types of things would be an example of a negotiation. Anytime you solve a problem together, that's a negotiation. Or even if you're working in a committee and you can get consensus on a course of action so that everybody agrees to support that and moving forward. So there can be a lot of different outcomes of a negotiation. And I think people tend to think of union contracts or settling a deal, in a sale as negotiations. But even if we're serving on a committee, if I can get that committee to all agree on what we're going to do, or on a school board on how they're going to vote, that certainly is a type of negotiation. So what are some of the skills in preparation? I think certainly you need to prepare yourself mentally, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we look into what I think is a good mental frame of mind that can, maybe I should just cut to the chase now, and then I'll enhance it in the future. If my mental frame of mind is I'm absolutely right, I'm not open to any other opportunities, or I only care about me winning, that's a kind of mental a kind of preparing mentally that can impede the solution, So there is something to be prepared, being prepared mentally. And part of that may be, I find when I negotiate, and there are lots of different kinds of negotiations, the way I prepare mentally is to think about the person I'm negotiating with and what are the challenges they're facing. So, for example, if I'm negotiating with somebody, say, with regards to work that I'm going to do in a district, and we're trying to negotiate how that work should go, I often recognize that that person has a superintendent or school board that they have to account for. So therefore, as I'm preparing mentally, I'm trying to think about what kind of pressures they would have in their role, and how do I use that knowledge to think about how I prepare my points and select my priorities and apply strategies. Because if I make it only about me, I'm not going to get a successful negotiation. I have to think about what it's like from the other person's point of view. It doesn't mean that my needs are not important, but if I'm only focused on my own needs, I'm blind a little bit, and I'm probably not going to be terribly persuasive. And then I think it is important to prepare your points. I think when people come into a negotiation, it's important to know not just what you want, but what are your priorities. So, for example, it's very rare in a negotiation that you get everything you want. So it's important to have bottom line things you can live with and things that you could compromise on. And I think the more you're aware of that, know your points and your priorities, I think the better off you are. And then I think it's important to select a place, and I recommend that all negotiations have time limits. They can get kind of tense after a point, and I think we can certainly get kind of stale if we let these things drag on. Sometimes people need a little time to get used to the idea they're not going to fully win, and if it drags on, it just starts to get negative. So it's always a good idea that if we're going to negotiate, especially contract negotiations, we're going to meet from 2 to 5, and when that time is up, we're just going to end this and we'll re-come back in a day, that we don't continue to drag on. Now, I think as we get close, you can start to have more round the clocks as we're getting really close, but I think especially early on it's important to have a time limit. By the way, how many of you would say at some point in your life you had to do some sort of a negotiation, not necessarily a formal one, but where you had to make an agreement with a contractor or make an agreement with colleagues or serve on a committee? And if you do, just write yes. So I want to make sure that you're at least relating to what I'm talking about. Okay. So I want to suggest to you that there are two types of situations you find yourself in the negotiations. And one is what I would call transactional, and the other is relationship negotiations. So what happens in a transactional relationship is it's a one-time event, and I don't really care about the other person because I'm probably never going to see them again. Okay? And so I don't care how big I win because I don't have to live with them. So I would certainly make a parallel to our personal relationships. So, for example, if you're a very strong-willed person and you have family members or a significant other who tends to be a person who is more likely to give in, okay, you may know that if you push hard, you can win. Okay, you can get what you want, but it can very often be an example of, you winning the battle and losing the war because of the types of resentments that can come from winning too big. So I think it's really important to think about what kinds of situations we're in. Now, I would certainly say when we are in school districts and we're interacting and negotiating with colleagues or people on a committee or even people in your own office about who's going to handle what, and certainly in contract negotiations, those are all relationship negotiations. And I'm going to come back and argue that winning big is not a good thing. And to give you a very specific example, without naming names of a district where the district won too big in the contract negotiations, and it ended up not being a good thing in the end. In fact, not good for either side in the end. So the idea isn't necessarily to always win big in a relationship negotiations. So let me fill this in a little bit more so you understand the difference between the two by giving you an example. So let's say that we have this diner that's located, off the interstate, or a restaurant at a rest stop, somewhere on the road where most of the customers I deal with are never going to come back again. I mean, the chances of them coming back, are very, very low because they don't live locally, okay? And so I'm not saying you should do this, but it certainly might be possible if I'm the only game in town to have my prices be too high and my food too lousy. And I can run a good business model that way because people can walk out having paid and saying, crap, I'll never come back to that place again, and the probability of them ever coming back is about zero. Now contrast that with I've got a restaurant in my town. I know one of the people is in Warwick, a place where I eat a lot. It's a lot of restaurants. So if I've got a restaurant in town in Warwick and I'm overpriced and the food is lousy, and people come, I might get away with having them come once, but at that point they're never going to come back to me again. And so it's a good example of winning the battle and losing the war. If I depend on repeat business, then I'm really going to, that's not going to help me very much because in the end, I'll end up actually losing more than I gain. So I use the example of the used car salesman. So if I've got a used car salesman at some, small site somewhere, he doesn't really care whether I'm unhappy after I buy the car. It's let the buyer beware. So, he might tell me that the car's in better shape than it is, okay, because he's not really going to care. For him, it's a one-time transaction. The probability of me coming back is low. And by the way, this is maybe a bit of a sidebar, but I have found in life, watch out for people who talk too much about how honest they are. You can pretty much bet if somebody's got a sign up that says honest used car, they're not. And when people frequently tell you about how honest they are when we start negotiations and how fair they are, those are the people that will rob you blind. Because people who have to keep talking about how fair you are probably trying to con you. So stick to people who just treat you fair, not who people who say it. Okay? But let me go back again and kind of contrast here. So in the case of this guy, and obviously this is from popular culture, it's from a movie. So this guy doesn't care how he scams you. But let me tell you who does care. Okay? This dealer. And here's why this dealer cares. You may or may not know this about car dealers, but they actually make more money on service over the life of a customer than they make on sales. I mean, after all, a good portion of the bulk of the money from the sale of a car goes to the maker. And while they do make some money on it, if you really look at it, they may make a few $1,000s on a car sale. $3,000, $2,000 on a car sale. But over the life of the car, with repairs, there's a good chance that they may make many more dollars. So if you go to that car dealer and you really feel that you were mistreated, you didn't really get a good value, you find out you got ripped off, you're probably going to feel negatively about that dealer, and you're probably not going to go for them for service. So in the end, this would be again an example of winning the battle and losing the war. They might benefit by making a higher amount of sale on the front end, but at the end of the day, they're not going to have you come back for another car, and you're not going to be servicing your car at a place you feel ripped you off. So I think that's just very telling. So I want to tell you the story of this negotiation, and it is local to our area in New York. For those of us who are in New York, it's a bit old. It was told to me by a superintendent, and I'll tell you a little bit about the background on it and how it went really terribly wrong. So what you had were two kind of the worst situations. Number one, on the union side, you had a very kind of rigid, dramatic union leader who, to be honest, was mostly focusing on a few matters that affected himself and his wife, who was a teacher in the district, and some of them had to do with some of the benefits. And one thing in negotiations is you can't win everything. So if you obsess about one thing, you may end up getting that, but you lose other things. So he was really, really pushed hard on these one or two items that were important to him, but actually not necessarily very important to the rank and file members of that bargaining unit. They did not really care that much about that. They had other priorities that he claimed to care about, but at the end of the day was willing to trade for what he wanted. On the other side, representing the district, they had a new person who was from a law firm. He was a younger attorney, and he wanted to make a name for himself by showing the district how much he could get from the union. Okay? So he wanted to win big because he thought this would be good for his reputation. So let me tell you exactly what happened. The worst of all possible worlds. So first, the union guy, got what he wanted. But in order to get what he wanted, he gave away the store on a lot of things that the rank and file really cared about, like salary and other benefits. And then the attorney, he got his big win, but then he went off to fame and glory, and the union and the district was stuck with the problem. And here's what happened, okay? Shortly after the negotiations, the rank and file members of the union figured out that they had just, that things hadn't worked out too well for them, and they kicked out the union leader, who very quickly thereafter retired. Now, that would be well and good because he was at fault, but unfortunately they didn't just fault him, they faulted the district for having given them such a lousy deal. And so what happened is there was deep resentment within the bargaining unit and a real determination to come back to the next negotiations with no compromise and with a great deal of anger towards the district. And so I think and that's exactly what happened. The second negotiations were horrible. Okay, and in a way, both parties had been victimized by somebody else. But it's a good example if you don't want to win too big, because at the end of the day, if you're the district, while you have to represent, you have a role in this. You have to represent the district and the taxpayers. You also have to remember that the union employees these are people that are supporting your kids, providing services to your kids, teaching your kids. And you don't really want them to have a negative feeling towards you or the district. So winning big is not the goal. So I'm going to stop and just see if anybody wants to comment on that. Just this notion that it isn't a great idea to win big when you're in a relationship negotiation. And that if you lose sight of this, you can fall into the trap. Anybody? Any thoughts, comments, political statements? Does it make sense? I guess everybody's pondering. Well, at least show me you're alive. Type so you're alive so I know you're there. So I make sure it's working. Okay. Okay. So this is kind of in keeping with this thinking or this logic. Thanks, Lynn. Okay. In keeping with this logic, because I never know if the system goes down, so that's why I want to check. Okay. So you have to really ask yourself, when you go into a negotiation, there's kind of two ways people can go into one. They can go into the one with a kind of a me first view or a we first view. So, for example, the sleazy car salesman, he goes into negotiations with a me first view. Okay? But you have to ask yourself, is this really, given the circumstance here, if this is a relationship negotiation, is it really going to benefit me by going into negotiation with a me first view? Now, that doesn't mean that, by the way, I may not come on strong in the beginning to establish my position. But I have to really think about what it is, what's my real goal? If my goal is to get an agreement we all can live with, then I'm not going to have a me-first attitude. I'm going to have a we-first attitude. And I would suggest to you that in almost every case where I'm doing work with committees or in negotiations, things go a lot better when we have a we-first view. By the way, I've certainly had situations where I felt the district had a we-first view and the union didn't. They had a me-first view. And I can understand that. I actually have often argued that this is one of the great disadvantages that districts have in negotiations, because they have to recognize there are these employees. But I'm often able to get people to a place, even if they start with me first, where we're on we first. And when we're there, that just opens the possibility for more solutions. So it's just something to keep in mind. By the way, it's something to also gauge. So when you're sitting in negotiations, I try to gauge, do I think that the people I'm negotiating with are real, just in spite of, verbal posturing, do I really think that they're in a totally me first place forever, or there's a possibility, or they may even already be in a we first place. So it's certainly fine in the negotiations to have a strategy. And an example of a strategy is just a thing like having your set of priorities or some of the arguments you're going to be made. But don't get too locked into it. Being rigid is never going to work effectively for you. It always hurts you. And it prolongs negotiations. The most effective negotiations are when the parties are nimble and open to new information, including the possibility that there may be another solution beyond the one that I've already, one that I came into the negotiation thinking was the only solution. And this is probably just, again, maybe some common sense logic, but since negotiations, unless people capitulate, okay, it's very rare that the outcomes you get what you expect to get when you come in is what you're going to get when you come out. And I remember somebody a long time ago saying, and at first I didn't really understand this, but now as I see this more, I can see it laid out for me, that I recognize that in most negotiations, people feel like they lost a little. That's you don't quite feel like you won. You kind of feel like you lost a little, and you can live with it. And that may seem like a terrible way to come out. It's so nice to be able to come out feeling like happy, but actually losing, each party feeling they lost a little and walking out being able to heal is really a good place to be. So, because you rarely are going to, and the more you are believed going in that you're going to get all of what you want, the more you're likely to have to feel like somehow you lost when you didn't get all of it. So it's just something to think about. So again, I want to focus on obviously the relationship type of negotiation. And I remember when I went to this conference, one of the presenters there told an interesting story about this great negotiator from Texas, and that's why I picked a guy with a hat, with a 10-gallon hat. That's probably a 5-gallon, but anyway. So this was a great negotiator from Texas. He was trying to negotiate a very big deal with a company, and so when he flew into town, the first thing he did is he hooked up with the person who was representing the other organization, the other company, and he said, "Let's go out to dinner." And they had dinner. And then he said, "You know what? I've never been to New York. I'd love to go to a ball game. I've got some tickets to a Yankee game. You want to go with me? Let's go." Now, you got to understand, the person from the other side, he's an all-business guy. What he wants to do is, he assumed on the first meeting they would be negotiating. And so far they've had dinner, and now they've gone to a Yankee game, and they still haven't started negotiating. And then he says the next day, "I'd love to go, and I've always wanted to go and see the Statue of Liberty. Can we go and spend some time? I'd like to look at the Statue of Liberty." And they go to the Statue of Liberty, and they go, and they're all talking, and they're getting to know each other, and they're not negotiating. And this guy's getting really frustrated. Why are we not negotiating? And so he finally says to the guy, "I thought we were coming to negotiate. Why are we not negotiating?" He says, "Well, we are." Because the most important part of a negotiation is establishing a relationship. And I believe that we're going to get a much better result if we get to know each other and we establish a relationship. So I consider this an important part of how we start. But if you're really worried about this and you feel like this is going to go on forever, let me just tell you that we're going to meet on Wednesday, and on Wednesday we're going to start talking about the details, so you don't think this is going to go on forever with you just sightseeing New York. But I really believe that this is important, because in all of my work, when I get to know people and we establish a relationship, I'm more able to see things from your perspective, and you're able to see mine. So don't always rush. I've even said in contract negotiations, not a bad idea for us to just go out and have some dinner and get to know each other before we rush into the items. So there is something to be said for this concept. So, and this goes back to just a very interesting idea or concept about our roles. By the way, are you seeing my slides change? Because I'm monitoring. There it goes. Okay? All right. So actually, let me go and talk about the two different paradigms of negotiations. So the old paradigm, which, by the way, I would argue is the default, it's what you tend to get, is the old paradigm is the other side is your opponent in the negotiations. So we're in a kind of a win-lose situation. It's like, I want to win, they're going to lose. And there's a term for that. It's called zero sum. That's where one person wins and one loses. And by the way, even in the negotiations with relationships, some items may be zero sum. So, for example, if I'm going to pay a higher price for something and you're going to charge me more, I don't see how that can ever be anything but a zero-sum item. And there are ways of dealing with zero-sum items. We can trade off. You'll win one and I'll win another. But when you approach this, traditionally it was a zero-sum game. The new paradigm is the problem-solving model. And I'm going to give you an example of this because I really learned this as a school board member in my own district. And I'm going to tell you a story about that, okay? But in the new paradigm, the parties are partners. So what they look at is they're trying to solve a negotiation problem in which we have different stakeholders. So the union is a stakeholder, the members are a stakeholder, the school board is a stakeholder, the public is a stakeholder. So we're seeing all of them as stakeholders. Or another way to look at it, so we're not only talking about contract negotiations, or if I'm serving on a shared decision-making team, and that team consists of parents, community residents, and staff and administrators, then the new paradigm is that I'm not trying to have the parents win at the expense of the teachers. I see each one of them as a stakeholder group. And we all have many stakeholder interests, and what we're looking for as an objective is a solution that's going to meet the needs of all of those stakeholders. So we're approaching it from the point of view of problem solving rather than opponent, winner, loser, opponent, adversary, parties in trying to work out a mutual agreement. Does that make sense? So you either have to tell me you're alive, or you have to say, yes, that makes sense, so I know you're with me. Okay? And any questions so far? I'm not hearing from anybody, so I want to make sure at least somebody say you're alive. Okay, good. All right. There you go. All right. So here's just an interesting idea, conceptual idea here, okay, is that in a negotiation, and by the way, this doesn't mean that I'm going to be weaker in trying to advocate for my position, but that I think that I'm going to be much more successful in a negotiation if I can understand the pressure of the other side. So if we think of a traditional contract negotiation, right, and I know that I'm negotiating with representatives of the union, I know that they have a pressure to deliver to their members. If I'm negotiating with, say, a facilities director, I know he's got pressure to be able to show that he's doing a good job to his business official or superintendent or board. So that's what I mean by understanding the other's pressures. If I can begin to understand the other's pressures, then I may be able to make some arguments why a solution I'm providing will in fact address that pressure. So if I'm blind to that, I'm only focusing on my pressures, what I need, then I'm not going to be as effective as a negotiator. I think the most successful negotiator, even if they're not going to agree to do what the other side wants to do, can not look at the other side as the enemy and evil, but rather say, I can imagine what it's like. These people have to go back to the public, or these people have to go back to their members, or these people have to go back to the PTA and explain what's going to be done and why this is a good idea. Okay? So this ability to understand the other's pressure is really central to being successful in negotiations. And what you do once you know that is then you try to show the other person how, by agreeing to what you're proposing, their needs are going to be met. And so if I'm completely blinded to their needs, I'm going to be basically arguing why this is good for me. And in negotiations, I have to convince people that what I'm asking them to do is good for them, not so much good for me, And so the ability to do that and know that and understand that is going to be so critical to the persuasion elements of this. So again, if you want to think about it in terms of steps, and I'm not obsessed with steps, but you could think of it as kind of going through stages. So the first is the opening and relationship building, which I kind of described, and this next step is really exploring how each party sees it from the other's perspective. And let me just say that people spend too much time talking and not enough time listening when they negotiate. So I'm so busy trying to figure out how I can make the best argument for my side, and what I'm not bothering to do is to do the careful listening that would allow me to understand the pressures from the other side. So that is why listening is more important than talking in the negotiations. And that's hard for people like me who like to talk. But I'm telling you, gauge a lot. By the way, I will tell you that sometimes when we do negotiations and we have multiple people in the room, we will assign one of the people to be a key listener. While I may be doing the talking and making my argument, but their job is to listen, look at body language, look at reactions. They may bring up 5 items, but you can see one is really dear to their heart. So the more I really understand the other side, the better off I am. And it's not about manipulating. It's more about deeply understanding where they're coming from. Okay? And through that process of understanding what I need and what they need, then we can start to talk about creating some movement. where are there some areas where we can first make an agreement? And by the way, it is always best. People often, I just got this question recently. I'm doing work with a school board, and they said I got a school board president said, we have some differences in opinion on the board about philosophy, and it's getting in the way. What do you suggest we do as a starting point? And I'm actually doing a retreat for them, which is largely around negotiating and making agreements. And I said to him, let's start with agreement. Let's not worry about where we agree, where we disagree. Okay, Diane, you lost the sound. Anybody else? Let me just check. I just want to make sure. Okay. Yeah, I obviously have to text her to tell her this, but generally, every once in a while, I'll lose it too. I just basically dial back in. Okay? And I obviously have to talk to her this way because she can't hear me. Okay, I'm going to continue. I'm recording anyway. Okay, so to go back to my story involving the board, I know this was the board president was a little bit, how should we say, not ye of faith. You have a lot of faith. And when he asked me that question, I said to him, no, why don't we start with where we have agreement? And then we'll work our way to where there's disagreement. I said, perhaps you're focusing so much on where you disagree, you're not really beginning by looking at all of the examples of where you do agree. Because I believe that agreement builds a foundation for how we can work out the areas where we disagree. So I told him, we're going to start with the most basic things and see if we can get consensus and agreement on them. So, for example, just so you know, I'm not talking in vague terms, we talked about whether or not we had some common agreement about what we thought a good school district should look like, and some common agreement about the goals we wanted to achieve, even if there was disagreement about how to get there. So he really liked that, because otherwise I wouldn't be doing this work. And I think that really wasn't just some flippant answer. That really is the way that I always approach any situation where I have parties disagreeing, is I work from agreement, and then we take on the easy things. So I always say start with low-hanging fruit, because you build an ability to deal with the more challenging things. If I know that the toughest thing in the negotiation is going to be money, or some really strict sticking point, that's not going to be where I start. I'll try to knock off as many of the things that I think we can get out of the way, before I do this. So I want to share with you a couple of terms that you're going to hear in negotiations. Like if you read a book on negotiations, you hear about them. And they're not completely alien from the ideas that I've been talking about. In fact, they kind of support it. And so I want to make a point when I said that, why in negotiations most people feel they lost a little. I think Zopa explains the reason for this. So obviously this most logically deals with situations involving money, but it doesn't only have to be about money. It could be about anything, okay? So here's an example. I have a buyer, right? And so obviously a buyer wants to pay as little as possible. So let's assume that the buyer, they would like to pay this particular price, the lowest price, right? Let's say an item is selling for $100, they'd like it for $10, okay? The seller, on the other hand, would like to sell it for the highest price, right? So he'd like to sell it for, $200 or even $100, okay? He wants to sell it for $100. Well, the buyer's not willing to pay $100. The buyer may be willing to pay $50, and the seller may be willing to sell at $50. So Zopa is defined at what you're willing to live with. It's not what you want. I want to pay $10. I want $100. It's what I'm willing to take. It's the highest price I'll pay, it's the lowest price I'll take. And this is the zone of agreement. It's what we can live with. Now, in this particular case, just the way I drew it visually, this may be a wide range. It may not always be that wide a range. I may never have expected that I can get it for $10. I was expecting it to be about $25, and I've had to kind of get used to the idea it's going to be $50, and the seller may have thought that I could get $75, and he's going to have to accept that I'm not getting that. I'm getting less. So I think it's just something to think about, even on items involving flexibility, or days off, or anything else. What's the ZOPA? Maybe I want 3 additional days, and I want 1 additional day, and we're able to reach it. But this is that zone of where negotiations take place, okay? So that's one term. Another one you're going to hear about is banta. And that's a little bit more confusing to understand conceptually. By the way, does everybody understand what ZOPA is? Just tell me yes if you do. The idea. I think it's fairly common sense. Yeah, okay. So banta is a little more interesting, and some people have a hard time wrapping their brain around it initially. But banta is the risk or consequence of not making an agreement. Because, think about it, if parties don't have an incentive to agree, they may never agree. And so I always liken this to a story involving 2 sisters, okay? And anybody in our group Italian? You can say whether you're Italian. I know Lynn is, just based on the name, or at least your husband was. Anybody Italian? Anybody know Italians? Okay. All right. Okay. So I don't think this only applies to Italian families, but I think it's just an interesting cultural thing that you may find interesting. Okay. So let's take this hypothetical involving 2 sisters, right? So you have 2 sisters, and let's say decades ago, they had a falling out, and that does happen sometimes between siblings. They have a falling out over something. We don't have to get into the details of what they are, but they have a falling out. And let's say that one now lives in New York, and the other lives on the West Coast. They live in California, and they rarely see each other. In fact, they may never see each other. It wouldn't be unusual in a situation like that for neither party to ever, for this, this conflict between them or disagreement to ever melt. It will go on for 25 years, and I've seen it, okay? But now let's contrast this to what certainly was very traditional in Italian families, and that was that they tended to live very close together, and they would all have dinner on Sunday afternoon at Mom's house. And so, Lynn, you can answer whether when you grew up that was the way it was. Everybody went to Mom's house or Grandma's house. Was that the case? No, I'm just waiting. All right. Anybody? So, okay, so now let's talk about what happens. Oh, you see? Now Corey's not even Italian, they did it. Okay, so now let's look at what happens now. Now, I have to be there every week with my sister. And because we're kind of in that close proximity, nobody wants the tension. There's a much higher probability that I would have settled this long ago if we were together than if we were not. Okay? Okay? That's your family? Oh, my goodness. Or it looks like your family. All right, but you get what I'm saying. Okay, all right. So what I'm saying is that, the very fact that you had to come together, okay, the very fact that you had to come together was a vehicle that kind of forced you to more likely negotiate and settle. And so where there is a consequence for the parties not making an agreement, there is much greater likelihood that there will be an agreement. And so, I use this as a good example. 2 people that live far away, old friends, and they never are around each other, are going to probably not make an agreement as fast as two people who live next to each other or two people who work in the same office. So, that's just one example of banta. Another example of banta is where, as a result of having a contract negotiations, we're not able to move forward with something, or people are not seeing their incentives. And that is one of the problems that I have with some negotiations, where there's really no consequence for letting this stuff just hang out there, because you know that whenever you finally make an agreement, it'll be retroactive, then there may not be as much pressure for an agreement as there would be in a situation where there's a risk in making no agreement. And again, that's the concept of banta. By the way, you could certainly see this in industry. One of the bantas of not making an agreement, say with a merchant, is that someone else could buy the car. So if I'm haggling with someone over buying, an item, and I say, let me think about it, let me get back to you on a used car, and somebody else could buy the car. So that's part of that's banta, that there is a risk in me hanging out. And that provides an incentive for people to want to negotiate. So again, I have a few more things to do. I'm going to try to do them in the time we have. So I think this is an interesting slide in terms of looking at this issue of consensus. And if you look at it in terms of access, it's really about how much you care about yourself versus how much you care about the other person. And this is for each party. Now, by the way, when I say how much you care about yourself, it could be that in this particular item, I don't care. So let's take this in a personal relationship. Let's say that I have a friend, and it could be a friend or a significant other, and my friend has some very specific preferences. Maybe they're one of these people who really, has food allergies or is a little more picky about food, and I don't really care. I want good food, but I don't really care where I eat it, So I may be in that negotiations, I may have a low for myself, and because they are my friend, I have a high regard for them, so I'm more likely to capitulate. We're not going to have a big issue over negotiating over where we're going to eat. I'm just going to say wherever you want to eat is fine with me. Okay, now if I'm particularly picky, and they're picky, and we're unable, then we're going to probably have contention. By the way, if none of us care, we're going to be saying, I don't know, whatever you think, it's fine. And you've probably had some of those, okay? If we both care, we're going to compromise. So, and that's when we have to say, okay, this time we'll go there, next time we'll go there. So I think this is pretty common sense, but real negotiations are really more like this. There are a whole bunch of these individual boxes of different items, salaries, flexibility, this, that, and so on any one item, we may not be in the same place. So this may be very important to you and not very important to me. So on that one, it's easy. On another one, it's very, very important to both of us, or very important to me, and I don't care if I win. So you have to kind of look at these as individual boxes for each item. And if we can find one where I don't care and one where you don't care, we can trade. And that's how often we deal with zero-sum items, because it's a higher priority for me than it would be for you. We're able to reach an agreement on it, okay? So just in the few minutes I have left, I want to suggest to you that positions, and I'm kind of introducing another term here, that and I understand if you need to leave, I'm recording it. Thank you again for coming in. I'll probably go till about 5 after, all right? But once people adopt strong positions, which means I really feel strongly I have to have it my way, if both parties have that, it's going to be difficult for us to find movement. And what I would say is sometimes it's a question of believing your own myths. I believe the only solution is my solution, when in fact there may be other options. And so I want to kind of give you a definition of a position. It's my assumption about how best to meet my needs. I must get this. And it's often a flawed assumption. So we're going to probably wrap up on this story because I think it's very telling. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about something that happened to me when I was a school board member. Okay? and of course I have a bit of a bias because I was on one side of these negotiations, but I think it was very telling about how we ended up coming up with a solution with the help of somebody who's still around, Ellen Rader from Columbia University, who is an expert in conflict resolution and negotiations. So here was the sticking point. We didn't really have an issue over salaries. We didn't really have an issue over flexibility. The fundamental issue was over contributions to medical. At the time, many companies, we were definitely moving away from a time when people got all of their medical provided by their employer, which was what it was when I started my career. You paid nothing out of pocket. By the time we hit, this was the mid-'90s, it was pretty common for people in industry to be paying at least something out of their paychecks for medical benefits. But it wasn't all that common in school districts. And we were getting quite a bit of pressure from the public that our teachers had too generous a package. This was the teachers. And so we were determined going into the negotiations that we had to have the teachers contribute to their medical. Let me tell you what the union's position was. The union's position was not a penny out of pocket, out of our paychecks. And the reason for that, and I'm just skipping a couple slides so I can get this done, and the reason for that was they felt, it wasn't even so much about the amount, okay? They actually felt that if they say agreed to $1 or $2, then the next negotiations it would be $5. So they felt they didn't want to open the door to that; it would be a slippery slope. So the union wanted them to contribute, and the board wanted them to contribute, and the union not a penny out of medical. And so the negotiations were pretty much deadlocked, but we had a very good superintendent, and she decided to bring up this wonderful person, Ellen Rader, from Columbia University. And what Ellen said to us is, she would not mediate. She would not negotiate. What she would do is help each of the parties, both of the parties, to have a better understanding of what the possibilities were. And thank you, Mary Lou. I realize there's a time frame. I'm still recording if you want to catch the end of this. And thanks again, okay? But anyway, so she said, all I'll try to do is help you understand what your needs are, because maybe within that there might be some movement. So I can only share with you my side of this because it was very revealing. So she met with us, and again, I've laid this out already, so I can skip this slide, okay? And she met with the school board, and she asked us, what do you need? And we said, we need the teachers to contribute to their medical. And she said, no, you don't. And we got a little bent out of shape over that. She said, no, you do not. And we said, no, yes, we do. And she said, no, you do not. And she said, I'll show it to you. She said, here's what you need. You need money. Doesn't necessarily have to come out of medical. You need money. And we actually pushed back on this. And we said, no, we need the symbolic piece of having it come from medical. And she said, okay, I could accept that. What you're saying is you need money coming from medical. And we said, okay, yes, that's what we need. So again, in the interest of time, because I only have a minute or two left, I'm going to tell you what we actually arrived at. We actually arrived at that the money wouldn't come from the teachers doing the money out of pocket. It was agreed that we would set up a committee that consisted of the teachers and the district, and they would identify $100,000 in savings out of medical. And this could involve some changes in co-pays. It could involve making sure that we had no employees who, say, had coverage with their spouses somewhere else. But they were going to find $100,000 in medical savings. So the reason why I want to share this with you is to show you where we ended up here and why we couldn't have ended up there if we really didn't understand that our original position wasn't the same as our need. Okay? So we actually agreed even that the money couldn't be found, there'd be a trigger. So here's what we came up with. This committee would meet, they would find the savings. That allowed the board to come back to the public and say we had gotten $100,000 in cost savings from the teachers. But it also allowed the union to be able to go back to its members and say, not a penny out of our paycheck. And that is why we were able to be successful. So I share that with you because I think that's the essence of great negotiations. We could not initially see that as a possibility because we were too locked into our particular views. And so in the end, both of us got what we needed, even though it wasn't what we initially thought we wanted. Okay? So I'm going to wrap up. Any questions, comments? I hope you found this helpful. Anybody? Well, thank you. And you folks have a great day. We'll see you next time. And as always, I'm recording. I'll send you a link to the playlist.